Gerald Harper grabbed the youngest child, a 4-year-old girl still clutching a rag doll, and shoved her onto the auction platform like she was a sack of grain. The crowd barely flinched. That little girl looked back at her mother with eyes that didn't understand what was happening. And her mother, a widow who had just buried her husband 3 weeks before, stood in the snow in a dress held together by a single button, watching a man she had called family destroy everything she had left. If that had been your child, if that had been your family, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, if they remind you that ordinary people can survive extraordinary cruelty, please subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that frozen morning and meet Evelyn Harper. The morning Gerald Harper came to collect what he believed was his, the temperature had dropped so low that the water in the kitchen basin had frozen solid overnight. Evelyn noticed it when she reached for a cup to rinse her face. She stood there a moment, staring at the solid gray ice, and thought, absurdly, stupidly, that she needed to remind Thomas to fix the gap under the door before winter came in harder. Then she remembered Thomas was in the ground, had been for 22 days, and there was no one left to fix anything. She heard the wagons before she saw them, 3 of them, rolling up the frozen road toward the house in the gray pre-dawn, lanterns swinging. She counted the horses from the window. 8 of them. Gerald didn't travel light when he was coming to take something. "Mama," Noah's voice quiet came from behind her. He was 14, her oldest, and he had her husband's way of appearing in a room without making a sound. He stood in the doorway to the kitchen, already dressed, already watching the wagons. He had the flat, controlled expression of a boy who had been doing a man's emotional work for 3 weeks straight. "That's Uncle Gerald." "I know," Evelyn said. "Should I wake the others?" She thought about it for half a second. She thought about letting the little ones sleep just a little longer, in the warmth, in the innocence of not knowing yet. But Gerald's wagons were already pulling into the yard, and she could see men jumping down from the beds, and one of them was carrying a length of rope, and she was not going to let her children be surprised by that. Not in their own home. "Wake them," she said, "and tell Clara to keep Lily close." Clara was 11. Lily was 4. Evelyn had been making Clara responsible for Lily since the funeral because she herself could not always hold herself together when Lily started asking where Papa was. And a mother falling apart in front of a 4-year-old does no one any good. She went to the front door. Gerald was crossing the yard already, his boots crunching on the snow, his breath fogging the cold air. He was Thomas's older brother by 7 years, and he had always held that seniority like a weapon. Big man, loud voice. The kind of man who made rooms feel smaller just by entering them. Behind him came 2 other men Evelyn recognized from town, Walter Pruitt, who worked at the land office, and a younger fellow named Conley, who people said Gerald kept around for unpleasant jobs. She opened the door before Gerald could knock. "Evelyn." He said her name like it was a verdict. "Gerald." She said his like it was a closed door. He looked past her into the house, that familiar habit of his, never fully looking at you, always surveying what was behind you, always calculating. "I need you to gather your things, you and the children. You'll be coming into town with us this morning." "On whose authority?" He reached into his coat and produced a folded set of papers and held them out to her. She took them. She read them slowly because she refused to show panic, even as her fingers went cold and her stomach dropped straight through the frozen floorboards. The papers claimed that Thomas Harper had died intestate, without a valid will, and that as the eldest male heir, Gerald Harper was the rightful inheritor of all property, land, and assets belonging to the Harper estate. The papers were dated 9 days ago and bore the seal of one Judge Emmett Crowell, a man Evelyn had heard Thomas describe as Gerald's man in the courthouse. "Thomas left a will," she said. Her voice came out flat and steady, which surprised her. "I witnessed it myself, so Doc Halverson." "Can't find any such document," Gerald said, and he smiled with just the bottom half of his face. "Checked everywhere. Nothing registered, nothing on file. If you've got a copy, you're welcome to produce it." She had a copy. It was in the strongbox under the floorboards in the study. She had not told anyone about that strongbox except Thomas himself, and she had not opened it since the funeral because she had told herself there was time. There was time. She had a few weeks before she needed to worry about the legal side of things, before she needed to think about anything except keeping 6 children fed and grieving and upright. She had been wrong about the time. "I need a few days," she said, "to gather the proper documents." "You've had 22 days, Gerald said. "The court's been patient. Today is the transfer date." He looked at his watch, a gold pocket watch, Thomas's watch, she realized with a sick lurch, the one that had been on Thomas's nightstand the morning of the funeral and had apparently traveled to Gerald's pocket sometime afterward. "We leave in 40 minutes. Pack what you can carry." "And if I refuse?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at her the way men like Gerald Harper look at women they've already decided don't matter, not with hatred, something worse than hatred, with complete indifference. "Then Conley and the boys pack for you," he said, "and it won't be gentle." She closed the door in his face. She heard him laugh once, short and flat, on the other side of it. In the hallway behind her, 6 children stood in various states of dress, 6 pairs of eyes watching her face for information. Noah, who already knew. Clara with Lily gripped against her side, exactly as she'd been told. Henry, 12. Thomas's build already forming in his shoulders. May, 9, who cried quietly and constantly since the funeral and was crying quietly now. Owen, 7, who had not cried at all and was starting to worry Evelyn more than any of them. And Lily, 4 years old, clutching her rag doll with both hands, wearing one sock. Evelyn looked at her children and she made a decision. Not a plan. She didn't have time for a plan. A decision. "We are going with them," she said. "We are going to walk out of this house with our heads up. Nobody cries in front of those men. Nobody begs. We are Harpers, and we walk like it." May sniffled and wiped her face with her sleeve. "Can I bring Mrs. Button?" Lily asked. Mrs. Button was the rag doll. "Yes, baby. Bring Mrs. Button." They packed in 35 minutes. Not 40. Evelyn would not give Gerald the satisfaction of the full time. She packed 3 changes of clothes per child, the family Bible, a photograph of Thomas taken 7 years ago, and a small tin box of dried herbs she'd grown herself because it was something she'd worked for, and she was not leaving it behind. She went to the door of the study, and she looked at the floorboard beneath the desk where the strongbox lived, and she calculated the risk of going for it with Gerald's men in the yard, and she decided, it destroyed her to decide this, that she could not risk it. Not with Conley standing 15 feet from the front door. Not yet. She walked away from the study, and she did not let herself think about what that decision might cost. The ride to town took 2 hours. They put Evelyn and the children in the second wagon, alone, which was almost merciful until she realized it was done so she couldn't hear what Gerald and Pruitt were discussing in the lead wagon. Henry tried once to climb over and listen. Evelyn pulled him back. "Not here," she told him with her eyes. "Not yet." The town of Cutter's Bluff came into view around a bend in the road, a small, hard cluster of buildings pressed into the landscape like it was trying not to be noticed. Evelyn had lived within 20 miles of this town for 11 years. She had bought flour here and sold eggs here and attended church here and watched 3 of her children born in a house 12 miles up the eastern road. She had never felt like a stranger in it. She felt like a stranger in it now. People were already gathered at the square. Too many people for a Tuesday morning. She counted 30, then stopped counting because the counting was making it worse. There was a raised wooden platform in the center of the square, not the auction platform, she thought at first, except that it was exactly the auction platform, the same one they used for livestock sales in the spring. Boards weathered gray, 4 steps up from the ground. Someone had cleared the snow off it, recently. "No," Evelyn said. She said it to no one. She said it to the air. Gerald's wagon stopped. Gerald stepped down. He turned to look at her in her wagon, and he had the expression of a man who has already finished a task and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. "It doesn't have to be ugly," he said. "The children will all be placed in good situations, working situations. They'll be fed. They'll be—" "You are not selling my children," Evelyn said. "Evelyn." He said it gently, which was more frightening than when he'd been cold. "You have no means of support, no property, no income. The court has determined that the children would be better served in established households where their labor, they are not cattle. Nobody said they are. This is a welfare placement. It's done all the time for—" "They are 7 years old." She was gripping the side of the wagon so hard her knuckles had gone white. Owen is 7 years old, Gerald. Lily is 4. Something shifted in his face for just a half second. Something that might have been discomfort if Gerald Harper were the kind of man capable of discomfort. Then it was gone. Come down from the wagon, Evelyn. She did not come down from the wagon. Conley came around the side and reached up and took her by the arm. Not brutally, but firmly. The way you handle something you're not worried will fight back. And that was the thing that finally cracked something open in Evelyn's chest. Not the pain of the grip, but the absolute certainty in his hands that she wouldn't resist. That she was already beaten. That certainty was somehow worse than the auction platform and the gathered crowd and all of it put together. She did not make a sound. She had told her children not to cry, and she would not be the one to break that. They stood on the platform together, the 7 of them, in the cold. The crowd watched. Evelyn had grown up being taught that people were fundamentally decent, that community meant something, that your neighbors showed up. She stood on that platform and looked at 30 faces she had known for years. The baker, the school teacher, the woman from the church committee who had brought a casserole to the funeral. And not one of them met her eyes. Not one of them stepped forward. They watched the way you watch something you know is wrong but have already decided is not your problem. Bids came quickly. A farmer from the Eastern Flats offered for Noah first, strong back, good age for field work. An older couple put a bid in for Clara, wanted a household girl. Another man Evelyn didn't recognize looked at Henry the way you look at a horse you're thinking of buying and asked his age and his strength twice. Every word landed in Evelyn's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She kept her face still. She kept her eyes forward. Beside her, she felt Lily press the rag doll against her leg. The bidding moved fast. Too fast. These arrangements had been made before the platform. Gerald had done his work early. She was watching Noah's face when she saw it. The exact moment the boy understood what was happening. Not understood in the vague way he'd understood since Gerald's wagons appeared that morning, but understood completely. Understood that he was about to be taken from his mother and his brothers and sisters and sold to a stranger for the use of his back and hands. His face went absolutely rigid. He was 14 years old, and he was trying not to cry the way boys try not to cry when they've been told that crying is weakness. And watching him fight himself was the most painful thing Evelyn had ever seen, and she had watched her husband die. She reached over and took his hand. He let her. He was shaking. "I'm going to fix this," she said very quietly, close to his ear. "I need you to believe me." She did not know if she was telling him the truth. She said it anyway. The bidding on Noah had just reached a number that made the farmer from the Eastern Flats look satisfied when a voice from the back of the crowd said, not shouted, just said, in a tone that somehow carried over everything, "I'll double it." The crowd shifted. People turned. Evelyn turned. The man standing at the back edge of the square was not someone she recognized. He was tall, which she registered first, heavily built through the shoulders in the way that comes from actual work rather than intention. His coat was worn in the way that expensive things get worn when someone actually uses them rather than displays them. He had a beard that had not been attended to recently, and dark eyes set under a low brow that gave him the look of a man permanently in the middle of a serious thought. He was holding his hat in his hands. He did not appear to be cold or nervous or in any particular hurry. He looked at the platform. He looked at Evelyn. "I'll take all of them," he said. Still that same quiet voice that somehow carried. "The mother too. Whatever the number is, I'll double it." Gerald Harper turned to look at the stranger with the specific expression of a man whose careful plan has just encountered something unexpected. "And who in the hell are you?" The stranger looked at Gerald the way you look at a door you're about to walk through. "Rowan Holt," he said. "I ranch up in the Caldwell Valley, and I'm making a legal offer at a legal auction." He held Gerald's gaze without effort, without hostility, just with the absolute steadiness of a man who has decided something and has no further use for discussion. "Unless this isn't a real auction, unless there's a reason my money isn't good enough." The crowd was very quiet. Gerald's jaw tightened. "Your money's good enough," he said. Rowan Holt put his hat back on. "Then I believe that concludes your business here," he said. He walked to the platform steps and stopped at the bottom and looked up at Evelyn. Up close, she could see that he was older than she'd first thought. Mid-40s, maybe, with the kind of face that had seen weather and kept most of its opinions about it to itself. He did not offer her his hand to help her down. He didn't presume. He just stopped at the bottom of the steps and waited. Evelyn looked at this stranger who had just paid an incomprehensible amount of money for the right to walk away with her and her 6 children, and she understood, with cold clarity, that she had absolutely no way of knowing whether this was rescue or a different kind of disaster. She also understood that the farmer from the eastern flats was still watching Noah with that satisfied expression. She stepped down off the platform. Noah came after her without being told, then Clara with Lily, then Henry, May, Owen, each of them moving past Gerald Harper without looking at him, and Gerald standing there with his arms at his sides and that bottom half smile gone completely, replaced by something harder and quieter that Evelyn recognized as the expression of a man who has lost a battle and is already planning the next one. Rowan Holt's wagon was at the edge of the square. He helped the smaller children up without ceremony, did it the way you'd help children into a wagon, practically no fanfare. And then he took the driver's bench and he did not explain where they were going or why he'd done what he'd done or what came next. Nobody asked him, not yet. The wagon moved. Snow began to fall again, light and purposeless, the way it does when winter isn't trying particularly hard. The town of Cutter's Bluff fell behind them. Lily pressed against Evelyn's side and held up the rag doll. "Mrs. Button is cold," she said. "I know, baby," Evelyn said. She wrapped her coat around both of them. On the driver's bench, Rowan Holt kept his eyes on the road and said nothing, and the silence around him was not the silence of a man with nothing to say. It was the silence of a man who has learned that most things people say in difficult moments aren't worth saying. Evelyn watched the back of his head, and she thought about Thomas's strongbox under the floorboards of the study. She thought about what was in it. She thought about what would happen when Gerald realized what she'd left behind, and more importantly, what she hadn't been able to take. She thought about the look on Gerald's face as the wagon pulled away. She was not safe. None of them were safe. A strange man's bid at an auction did not make them safe. Justice, if it was coming, was still a long way down a frozen road. But her children were beside her, all 6 of them. And for right now, for this exact frozen, uncertain, terrifying moment, that was the only thing she was going to allow herself to count. The wagon ride took the better part of 4 hours, and by the time the road began climbing into the foothills, the snow had stopped pretending to be light and purposeless, and had committed itself fully to the kind of heavy, driving fall that erased the horizon. Evelyn could no longer see where the road ended and the fields began. She could no longer see much of anything except the backs of Rowan Holt's shoulders and the slow, steady movement of the horses ahead. The children had gone quiet in stages. Owen first. He had been quiet since the funeral and saw no reason to change that now. Then Henry, who spent the first hour watching Rowan's back with the particular calculation of a 12-year-old boy deciding whether a man is dangerous. Then May, who cried herself empty somewhere around the second hour and fell into a gray, exhausted stillness against Evelyn's arm. Clara kept Lily occupied with a game involving Mrs. Button and an imaginary tea party, which was either very brave or very automatic. Evelyn couldn't tell which and didn't have the heart to examine it too closely. Noah sat at the far end of the wagon bed, facing backward, watching the road disappear behind them. Evelyn watched Rowan. He hadn't spoken since Cutter's Bluff, hadn't explained himself, hadn't offered reassurance, hadn't done any of the things a man trying to seem trustworthy would do. He just drove. Steadily, competently, making small adjustments to the reins that kept the horses moving without strain through the thickening snow. There was nothing performative about him. That was either a good sign or a very sophisticated bad one, and she didn't know him well enough to tell the difference. After the 3rd hour, Henry crawled forward to the bench and sat beside Rowan without asking permission. Evelyn tensed. Rowan did not react. He just moved slightly to give the boy room, the way you make space for something that has already decided to sit next to you. Henry rode there for 10 minutes before he spoke. "You got cattle up there?" he asked. "Some," Rowan said. "How many?" "Enough." "Enough for what?" Rowan glanced at him sideways. "Enough that I'm not going to run out any time soon." Henry appeared to consider this an acceptable answer. "You got horses besides these 2? 7. Working horses or show? Do I look like a man who keeps show horses?" Henry looked at him. "No," he said, in a tone suggesting this was a point in Rowan's favor. He rode in silence for another few minutes. Then, "Why'd you do it?" Rowan didn't answer right away. He watched the road. He adjusted the reins once, minimally. Saw something that needed stopping, he said finally. That's not a reason, Henry said. No, Rowan agreed. It's not. He didn't offer anything more. Henry seemed to understand that was all he was getting and retreated back to the wagon bed, and Evelyn filed the exchange away in the growing and deeply uncomfortable file she was building in her mind, under the heading of things about Rowan Holt she could not yet explain. The ranch came into view just as the last of the gray light was failing. It was not what she'd expected, though she hadn't known what she'd expected. A main house, 2 stories, solid and square, built from timber that had darkened with age but hadn't softened. It had the look of something that had been built to last rather than to impress. A barn set back and to the left, large, well-maintained. A smaller structure beside it that might have been a smokehouse. Fencing that went on further than she could see in the dark. The whole thing sat in a valley that had mountains on 3 sides, and the mountains made it feel like being held rather than enclosed, which was not a feeling Evelyn trusted herself to find comforting right now. Rowan stopped the wagon at the front of the house. He got down, tied the horses off, and turned to look at the wagon full of people he had bought and brought home. There's a room upstairs with 2 beds, he said. Boys can take that. I've got a smaller room on the ground floor. Girls and your mother can take it. I'll sleep in the barn. You don't have to, Evelyn started. I'll sleep in the barn, he said again, in the same tone, not unkind, but clear. There's food in the kitchen. Stove's not lit, but the wood's dry and the flint's on the shelf above it. I'd appreciate it if someone kept the fire going through the night. Temperature drops hard up here. He looked at the children for a moment, then back at Evelyn. You're not locked in. The road's impassable in this snow. But come morning, if you want to leave, you can leave. I won't stop you. Where would we go? Evelyn said. It came out more bitter than she intended. Rowan's expression didn't change. That's your question to answer, not mine, he said. I'm just telling you the door isn't locked. He got their bags from the wagon, all of them, without being asked, without ceremony, set them on the porch, and walked to the barn. He didn't look back. Evelyn stood in the snow in front of a stranger's house with 6 children ranged around her and a dead fire inside and absolutely no idea what the next 24 hours looked like. And she thought, with the specific, airless clarity that comes at the far end of an exhausting day, that this was either the first night of something or the last night of something, and she would not know which for a while yet. Mama, Owen said. It was the first word he'd said since morning. Yeah, baby. Is this our house now? She didn't have an answer for that either. Let's go get that fire started, she said. The inside of the house was clean in the way that places get clean when someone lives alone and doesn't make much mess, rather than when someone cleans them often. The kitchen was orderly. The furniture was plain and heavy and had been there a long time. There were no decorations anywhere that she could see, nothing personal on the walls, no photographs, no pieces of the kind of domestic softness that accumulates when a family lives somewhere. Whatever this house had been before, it had been scraped clean of evidence. Noah got the fire going. I was good at fires, Thomas had taught him, and Thomas had been thorough about the practical things, whatever else he'd left unfinished. Henry found a tin of beans and another of salt pork in the pantry and set them to heat without being asked, which made Evelyn look at him for a moment with the particular pride that comes mixed with grief, because he was so much his father's son and his father was dead. They ate at the kitchen table, 7 of them in a stranger's house, and nobody talked much. Lily fell asleep in her bowl. Clara carried her to the ground floor room and came back and ate her own food standing up because there wasn't a spare chair. After, when the younger ones were in bed and Noah and Clara were still sitting at the kitchen table not sleeping, Evelyn did a thing she would not have done if she weren't desperate. She went to the barn. The door was heavy. She pushed it open and the warmth of the animals hit her first. Horses and hay, and the smell of something living that wasn't cold, which was more of a relief than she expected. Rowan was on a cot in the far corner, still dressed, not sleeping either. He sat up when she came in. Is something wrong with one of the children? He asked immediately. No, they're all right. She stood there. She had come out here with a purpose, and now that she was here, the purpose felt presumptuous. I needed to ask you something. He waited. What do you want from us? She said. And I need the actual answer, not the short one you gave Henry. He was quiet for long enough that she started to think he wasn't going to answer. Then he put his feet on the ground and sat forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the straw. Nothing. he said. Men don't spend that kind of money on nothing. I know how it looks. Then help me understand how it actually is. He rubbed the side of his jaw. It was the first uncertain gesture she'd seen from him. I was in Cutter's Bluff buying feed, he said. I didn't know there was an auction. I saw the platform and I thought it was a livestock sale. I saw the crowd gathering and I rode closer. He stopped. Started again. I saw that man put your little girl on the platform, and I had money in my coat and I stopped thinking. Evelyn looked at him. That's it. That's it. You spent that much money because you stopped thinking. Yes. She didn't know whether to believe him. She didn't know whether it mattered whether she believed him, given the alternatives. What happens in the spring, she said, when the roads open? You go wherever you have to go. And until then? Until then, you're not sleeping in the snow. He looked up at her. I'm not asking you to trust me. I know you can't yet. I'm just saying that right now there's no trick. There's a house and food, and I've got room. That's all I'm offering. She stood there another moment. She was looking for the angle, the catch, the thing underneath the thing he'd said, because there was always something underneath. She had lived long enough to know that. She didn't find it, which meant either it wasn't there or he was better at hiding it than anyone she'd met. Neither option was particularly comfortable. All right, she said. She went back to the house. She did not sleep well. The first week was the strangest of Evelyn's life, which was saying something given recent competition. Rowan moved around the ranch with a kind of concentrated economy of motion that made him seem like a smaller presence than he was. I was up before dawn every morning, out with the cattle, back at midday to eat whatever was in the pantry, out again in the afternoon. He did not hover. He did not check on them. He left them alone in a way that was so deliberate it had to be intentional. On the third morning, Owen appeared at the barn door while Rowan was working on a section of broken fence rail. Rowan did not tell him to go inside. He also did not speak to him. He just worked. Owen watched for a while. Then he said, "Can I do something?" "Hold this," Rowan said, and handed him one end of the rail. Owen held it. Rowan nailed it. They worked in silence for 20 minutes. At the end, Rowan nodded once in Owen's direction in a way that was not quite thanks and not quite dismissal, but something between the two. Owen went back inside looking like a slightly different version of himself than the one who'd gone out, and that difference was small enough that nobody else noticed, and large enough that Evelyn did. She noticed a lot of things that week that she told herself she didn't have time to think about. On the fourth day, Noah found her in the kitchen. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, which was his version of being prepared for an argument. "I don't think we should get comfortable here," he said. "I know. He could be anything. We don't know anything about him." "I know that too." "So why are we—" "Because it is minus 15 degrees outside and I have 6 children, and the alternative was Owen being sold to a man who wanted to use his hands in a field. So we're here until we have a better option, and I will let you know when I locate that option, Noah." She said it quietly, without heat, because she was too tired for heat. "I'm not comfortable here. I'm not going to get comfortable here. But I'm also not going to tell my children to be frightened of the man who stopped the auction until I have a reason." Noah uncrossed his arms. He didn't apologize. He was too much his father's son for that, but he uncrossed his arms, which was his version of conceding a point. "I'm keeping my eyes open," he said. "Good," she said. "So am I." What she saw over the following days was this. Rowan Holt was not a man who explained himself. He answered direct questions with direct answers and evaded nothing except things he clearly considered private, and the private things he evaded not with deflection but with silence, which was a different thing. He was patient with the younger children in a way that was not warm exactly. It was more like steadiness, the patience of a man who has been still for a long time and doesn't get rattled by noise. When Lily climbed on things she wasn't supposed to climb on, he moved her down without scolding. When May had a crying spell at dinner on the 5th night, he didn't comment on it, and he didn't leave the room, and he didn't try to fix it. He just sat there, eating his food, present without intrusion, and somehow that was the right thing to do, even though Evelyn would not have predicted it. Henry had begun helping him with the cattle in the mornings. It started without announcement. Henry simply put on his coat one morning and followed Rowan out, and Rowan didn't send him back. By the end of the week, they were working with a kind of wordless efficiency that suggested they had been doing it longer than 6 days. Henry came in from those mornings different from how he went out, not happy exactly, but purposeful. And purpose was something her children had been running low on. On the 8th night, after the children were in bed, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the family Bible open in front of her, not reading it, just needing something solid to put her hands on. And Rowan came in from the cold and stopped in the doorway. "You didn't have to keep the lamp on," he said. "I wasn't keeping it on for you," she said. "I can't sleep." He went to the stove and poured himself coffee from the pot she'd left there and stood leaning against the counter. He looked at the Bible. "Was he a good man?" he asked. She was caught off guard by the directness of it. "Yes," she said. "He was a good man. Not a perfect one, but good." "Did he know about his brother?" She thought about that. "He knew Gerald was hard," she said. "He thought he could manage him. He thought there was a line Gerald wouldn't cross." She ran her thumb along the spine of the Bible. "He was wrong." Rowan nodded slowly. He looked at his coffee. "My wife was sick for 2 years before she died," he said. "It was offered simply, without preamble, and it landed in the room like something that had been waiting to be set down. I thought if I kept the ranch going, kept things in order, that would be, I don't know, useful. She used to tell me I expressed love through productivity." He almost smiled saying it. "Didn't quite get there." "She wasn't wrong." Evelyn looked at him. "How long ago?" 3 years. He straightened up, set the coffee down. "Point is, I know what a house feels like after. I know what it does to you." He was not looking at her when he said the next part. "The kids are going to be all right. It takes time, and then it takes more time, and then one day it takes less time." "Is that something someone told you?" "No. It's something I noticed happening and then looked back and understood afterward." She sat with that for a moment. "That's actually helpful," she said, and she meant it. "Good." He moved toward the back door. "I'll try to have the roof on the east corral patched by week's end. It's letting snow in on the feed." "Rowan." He stopped. "Thank you," she said. "For the other thing, what you said." He nodded once, the same way he'd nodded at Owen over the fence rail. Not dismissive, acknowledging. Then he went out into the cold and she sat at the table with the lamp burning and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not safety, not happiness, nothing that clean, but something that was at least in the same neighborhood. A slight tentative lessening of the sense that everything was collapsing. She told herself not to trust it too quickly. She was right to be careful. Because 11 days after they arrived at the Caldwell Valley Ranch, Clara came in from the yard white-faced and told Evelyn there was a rider coming up the road. One rider. Moving fast. Evelyn was at the window before Clara finished the sentence. The rider was a man she didn't recognize, which could mean nothing, or could mean he was someone Gerald had chosen specifically because she wouldn't recognize him. He came into the yard and stopped and called out, not for Evelyn, but for Rowan. And Rowan came out of the barn, and they spoke for several minutes in the yard, too far for Evelyn to hear. When the rider left, Rowan came inside. He put his hat on the hook by the door. He took his coat off and hung it up. He moved slowly, the way he moved when he was thinking rather than when he was hurrying. "That was a man named Dessel," he said. "He carries messages for people in town when they pay him enough." He looked at Evelyn. "Gerald Harper has filed with the territorial court. He's arguing that my bid at the auction was fraudulent, that I misrepresented my intent, and that the children were never legally transferred to my custody. He's asking the court to reverse the transaction and order you all returned to Cutter's Bluff pending further proceedings." The kitchen was very quiet. "Can he do that?" Noah said. He was standing in the hall door. He had been listening. "He can file it," Rowan said. "Whether the court accepts it is another thing." "But it could happen," Noah pressed. "They could send us back." Rowan looked at him. He did not offer false comfort. "It's possible," he said. Evelyn had not sat down and she didn't sit down now. She was running figures in her head. Not money figures, legal ones. How long a territorial court filing would take. What Gerald would do in the meantime. Whether there were legal grounds to fight it without the documents that were sitting under the floorboards of the study back at the Harper Ranch, which was now legally Gerald's property, which meant she could not simply walk back in and retrieve them. "There's something else," Rowan said. She looked at him. "He's named you specifically in the filing," Rowan said. He's arguing that your living here in an unmarried man's house constitutes improper moral conduct and that you are therefore unfit to retain custody of the children. The silence got heavier. He's using that, Henry said flatly. He was in the doorway behind Noah now, and his voice had the particular flat edge that Thomas's voice had gotten when he was suppressing something large. He's using that, Rowan confirmed. Evelyn moved to the window and looked out at the snow-covered yard and the fence line and the mountains beyond it. She stood there long enough for everyone in the room to wonder what she was thinking. What she was thinking was this. Gerald had planned this before the auction. The auction itself had been a trap. Either he kept the children and broke the family apart that way, or someone interfered and he broke them apart this way. He had prepared both paths. That was Gerald Harper. He never moved without the move after the move already mapped. I need to get back to the house, she said. Evelyn, the documents. She turned around. Thomas's will. The original land deeds. They're in a strongbox under the floorboards of the study. I left them because I didn't have a choice. I need them to fight this filing. She looked at Rowan. And before you tell me that's Gerald's property now and I can't just walk in. I wasn't going to tell you that, Rowan said. She stopped. I was going to tell you, he said carefully, that we'd need to go at night, and we'd need to go soon before Gerald thinks to look for anything that might still be there. He picked his coat back off the hook. Road should be passable by tomorrow. We could leave after the children are asleep. Noah stepped fully into the kitchen. I'm coming. No, Evelyn said. Mama, someone has to stay with the little ones. She held his gaze. I need you here. Not because you're the oldest, because you're the one I trust to hold this together if we're not back by morning. Noah stood there with everything he wanted to argue visible in his face, and then he put it away, the same way he'd been putting things away since his father died, and he nodded. Clara had appeared in the doorway too, holding Lily, who had gotten up from bed and was now mostly asleep against Clara's shoulder with Mrs. Button pressed to her cheek. The whole family was in this kitchen, all 6 children and Evelyn and Rowan, standing in a circle of lamplight in a borrowed house in the mountains, while Gerald Harper filed papers in a courthouse 2 days' ride away. We'll be back, Evelyn said. She said it the way she'd told Noah she'd fix it that morning on the auction platform, with the specific conviction of someone who does not know if it's true and says it anyway because the alternative is worse. She met Rowan's eyes. He gave her the same look he'd given Henry over the fence rail and Owen over the hammer and her across the kitchen table when he talked about his wife. Steady, present, not promising anything, just there. That was going to have to be enough. They left at 10:30 when the children were asleep, and the ranch was as quiet as it ever got. Rowan had 2 horses saddled before Evelyn came out of the house. Not the wagon horses, 2 others from his string, a dark roan and a gray mare that moved with the compact, ground-eating stride of an animal bred for distance rather than show. He handed Evelyn the gray's reins without ceremony, the way he handed things to people when he'd already decided they could handle them. The night was hard and clear. The snow had stopped and the cold had tightened down into something serious, the kind of cold that doesn't blow, just sits, pressing against every exposed edge of you with patient, impersonal force. Evelyn pulled her scarf up over her jaw and followed Rowan out of the valley onto the lower road heading east toward Cutter's Bluff, and neither of them spoke for the first hour because there was nothing useful to say yet, and both of them seemed to understand that. She thought about the strongbox the whole way. She had thought about it every day since they left, the way you think about a thing you should have grabbed when the house was burning, with the specific grinding guilt of a decision you made for practical reasons that might turn out to have cost everything. Thomas had put that strongbox there himself. He had shown her once, lifted the floorboard, shown her the box, said there's the will and the deeds and the water rights and a letter for each of the children when they're grown. He had done it the way men do things they consider responsible preparation, not premonition. He was 41 years old and healthy, and he had not expected to need those documents for another 30 years. Neither had she. Around the second hour, Rowan slowed and pulled alongside her. When we get there, he said, low, we go in through the back, kitchen door. Thomas have a key somewhere outside. Loose brick in the well housing, she said. Left side. He nodded. We get the box and we leave. We don't look around, we don't take anything else. The faster we're out, the better. I know. If there's anyone there, Rowan. He looked at her. I've been thinking about how to get into that house since the morning we left it, she said. I've been over it more times than I can count. I know what we're doing. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. But I appreciate that you went through it anyway, she added, because she did, and because she was not so proud that she couldn't say so. They rode without talking after that, but the silence was different from the early silence, less careful, more companionable, which was a thing she noticed and decided to examine later when she had the luxury of time for that kind of noticing. The Harper Ranch came into view just after midnight. Evelyn felt the sight of it physically, a kind of tightening in the chest that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger, but had something of both in it. The house was dark, no smoke from the chimney. Gerald hadn't moved in yet. The roads, as Rowan had noted, had only just become passable, and Gerald was not the kind of man who roughed it when he didn't have to. He would come in his own time, with his own men, and make himself comfortable in the house his brother had built, and Evelyn needed to be gone before that happened, and needed to have what she came for before she went. They left the horses in the tree line north of the barn. Rowan went first to the well housing and found the brick she'd described and the key behind it. The kitchen door was frozen at the frame, not locked, just swollen with cold, and Rowan put his shoulder to it with the specific, practiced pressure of someone who has dealt with frozen doors before, and it opened, not loudly, but not silently either, and they both froze in the opening and listened. Nothing. The house was empty. It smelled of cold and disuse, that particular smell of a place where the heat has been off for weeks, where the air has stopped moving and everything in it has started a slow process of settling and stiffening. Evelyn moved through the kitchen in the dark without a lamp. She knew this house with her feet. She had walked this floor 8,000 times in 11 years, knew where the boards creaked, knew the slight dip near the pantry, knew the way the hallway turned and how many steps to the study door. Rowan followed her, and she could hear that he was good in the dark, moving without the fumbling uncertainty of a man out of his element. The study was at the back of the house. She pushed the door open and went directly to the desk and got down on her knees and reached under it and found the edge of the loose floorboard with her fingers and pried it up. The strongbox was there. She hadn't realized how much of her had been braced for it not to be there until she felt it under her hands and something unknotted in her spine. She pulled it out. It was heavier than she remembered, or maybe she was just tired. She turned to Rowan in the dark and he was already there, already reaching to take it from her, and she handed it over. That's everything, she said quietly. Then we go. They turned toward the door. The lamp came on. It was not their lamp, it was already in the room, on the far side of the desk, behind the door, which was why neither of them had seen it when they came in. And holding it, standing in the corner between the bookcase and the window, with an expression that Evelyn had never seen on her face before and would not easily forget, was Nora Harper, Gerald's wife. She was holding a rifle, not raising it, not aiming it, holding it, loosely, pointed at the floor, with the specific tension of someone who has made a decision and is waiting to see if she has to act on it. Evelyn had known Nora Harper for 11 years, had sat across from her at Sunday dinners and harvest celebrations, had believed, in the careless way you believe things about people you see regularly, that she understood her. She did not recognize the woman standing in this corner. This woman had been here waiting, in the cold, in the dark, which meant she had known someone was coming, which meant Gerald had sent her, or she had come on her own, and Evelyn did not know which was more unsettling. Nora, Evelyn said. Put the box down, Evelyn. You know what's in it. I know what you think is in it. I know what Thomas put in it himself. I watched him. Nora's chin came up slightly. In the lamplight, she looked older than the last time Evelyn had seen her, at the funeral, standing 3 feet from Gerald, and never once looking at Evelyn directly. Gerald says the will is invalid, that Thomas wasn't of sound mind when he made it. Thomas was of completely sound mind, and you know it. What I know doesn't matter. There was something in Nora's voice that wasn't quite what Evelyn expected. Not the flat certainty of a woman executing her husband's instructions, but something rougher, more complicated. Something that sounded like it had been argued over internally for a long time. What matters is what Gerald has filed and what the court will accept. Then let the court decide, Evelyn said. Let them see these documents and decide. If the will is invalid, a judge will say so. If it isn't, a judge will say that too. Gerald won't let it get to a judge. Nora, he has men, Evelyn. He has Judge Crowell and he has Pruitt and he has men who will make things very difficult for anyone who tries to walk those papers into a courthouse. She said it not like a threat, but like a fact she was tired of carrying. I'm not telling you this to help him. I'm telling you so you understand what you're walking into. Rowan had not moved and had not spoken. He was standing slightly behind and to the left of Evelyn, and she was aware of him the way you're aware of a solid thing when you're standing near an edge. Nora, Evelyn said again, more carefully. What are you doing here? Not what Gerald told you to do. What are you doing here? Nora's grip on the rifle shifted, not raising it, just adjusting. Gerald doesn't know I'm here, she said. The room was very still. He told me the house was empty, Nora continued, and her voice had changed again, flatter now, directed at some point in the middle distance. He's been telling me a lot of things are one way when they're another way, for a long time. She looked at Evelyn. I saw what he did at that auction. I was in the wagon on the edge of the square, and I watched him put your children on that platform, and She stopped, started again. I told myself it was legal. I told myself it was a welfare placement. Those were his words, welfare placement, like it was something the court arranged rather than something he arranged. Her jaw tightened. And then I watched you standing up there with Lily, and I thought, Lily is 4 years old, and I didn't say anything, and I went home and I've been sitting with that. Evelyn looked at her for a long moment. So what are you going to do? She said. Nora looked down at the rifle in her hands. She looked at it the way you look at something you've been holding so long your hands have cramped around it and you're not sure how to let go. Then she held it out, barrel pointed at the floor, grip toward Evelyn. I'm going to step outside for some air, she said. I'm going to be outside for about 15 minutes, and whatever you do or don't find in that house in those 15 minutes is something I don't know anything about. Evelyn reached out and took the rifle. She handed it to Rowan without looking away from Nora. He forged papers, Evelyn said. You know that. I know more than that. Nora's voice was almost inaudible. There's a man named Aldous Crimp. He's 70 years old and he lives above the farrier's shop in Cutter's Bluff, and he doesn't come out much anymore. He was a notary. He certified those papers Gerald filed, the ones claiming Thomas died without a will. She pulled her coat tighter around herself. Aldous didn't do it freely. I heard Gerald on the porch one night, heard what he told Aldous he'd do to him if he didn't certify them. She met Evelyn's eyes one last time. I've been living with that too. Then she walked past them, out of the study, through the kitchen, and out the back door into the frozen night. Rowan looked at Evelyn. 15 minutes, Evelyn said. They used 12. She found 2 additional things in the study she hadn't known were there. A second letter from Thomas, sealed, addressed to Gerald in Thomas's handwriting, which she took without opening, and a record book she recognized as the one Thomas kept for the property registry, cross-referenced with the water rights filing from 6 years ago, which she also took. Rowan had the strong box already. She wrapped everything in her coat, tied it tight, and they went out the way they came in, through the kitchen, the frozen door pulling shut behind them with a sound like a book closing. Nora was standing at the edge of the yard, back to the house, looking at the mountains. She did not turn around when they passed. They were in the tree line and on the horses before anyone said anything. She could send someone after us, Rowan said. She could, Evelyn agreed, but she won't. How do you know? Because she didn't send anyone while she was standing in that room with a rifle and 15 minutes to make whatever choice she was going to make. She already made the only choice she's going to make tonight. Rowan said nothing to that. They pushed the horses back toward the western road and the long ride home, and Evelyn held the wrapped bundle against her chest the whole way, feeling through the wool the hard corners of the strong box, and thought about Aldous Crimp above the farrier's shop, and Thomas's sealed letter to Gerald, and Nora Harper standing in the yard looking at the mountains. She thought about Gerald's face at the auction when the bid was doubled. She thought about the move after the move. There was a courtroom in this somewhere. There had to be. Because documents without a courtroom were just paper, and paper against a man like Gerald Harper, without someone to read it in public and put it into the record, was nothing more than kindling. The horses moved steadily through the dark. Rowan kept pace beside her without crowding her, without filling the silence with things that didn't need to be said, and she was beginning to understand that this was not coldness in him. It was a form of respect. He had decided she was capable, and he behaved accordingly, which was more than most men she'd known had ever done. They made it back to the Caldwell Valley Ranch, just as the sky was beginning to consider becoming something other than black. She could see the lamp in the kitchen window from the road. Noah, keeping watch. Of course. She had told him she'd be back by morning, and he had taken her at her word and stationed himself at the window to confirm it. Rowan took the horses to the barn. Evelyn went inside. Noah stood up from the chair when she came in. He looked at the bundle in her arms, and then at her face, and then back at the bundle. "You got it," he said. "We got it." She set the bundle on the kitchen table and unwrapped it. The strongbox. Thomas's letter. The registry book. She put her hand flat on the strongbox lid. "There's a man in Cutter's Bluff who can help us. A witness. He certified Gerald's false papers under duress. Someone threatened him. If he'll testify to that, Gerald's entire filing collapses." "Will he testify?" "I don't know yet." Noah looked at the strongbox. His jaw was working. "What if he doesn't?" "Then we use what we have and we fight with that and we see what a judge decides." "And if the judge is Crowell?" "Crowell's a local magistrate. This filing is in the territorial court. That's above Crowell's jurisdiction. Gerald might own Crowell, but he doesn't own a territorial judge." "He might." "He might," she agreed. "But that's a problem for when we know it's a problem. Right now I need to open this box and make sure everything Thomas put in it is still there." She found the key in her skirt pocket. She'd kept it on her person since the morning Gerald's wagons had appeared, which was either foresight or stubbornness. She wasn't entirely sure which. She fit it to the lock. It opened. The will was there. 3 pages, Thomas's handwriting, witnessed by Doc Halverson, and signed by 2 other men she recognized. The land deeds were there, original county registration, the water rights documentation, the letters for the children, 6 of them, sealed, each one with a name on it in Thomas's careful hand. Noah, Clara, Henry, May, Owen, Lily. She had known the letters were there. She had seen Thomas seal them and put them in. Seeing them now, seeing Lily's name written by Thomas's hand when Lily was barely a year old, when he had written it with the casual, forward-looking love of a father who expected to be alive for 50 more years, it did something to her chest that she couldn't control, and she stopped trying to. She sat there for a minute with her hand on those letters, and she did not make a sound, but she was not all right, and she did not try to be all right. Noah sat down across from her. He didn't say anything. He put his hand over hers on top of the letters. He was 14 years old, and he was still learning how to be in the world, and he sat there with his mother in the gray pre-dawn and held her hand, and that was the right thing to do, and he knew it. After a while, Evelyn straightened. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She squared the documents back into the strongbox and closed the lid. "In the morning," she said, "I need to write a letter to the territorial courthouse in Harlan's Creek. And I need to find out who is presiding over Gerald's filing and whether there's a way to request an expedited hearing given the circumstances." "How do we get the letter there?" "Rowan will know someone who rides that direction regularly." Noah absorbed this. "You trust him," he said. Not accusing, just noting. "I'm getting there," she said, because it was true, and because she was not going to lie to her son about the state of her own judgment, even when it was inconvenient. "He rode through a frozen night to help me get these papers. That's worth something. It could be calculated. Everything could be calculated. At some point you make a call based on what you've seen and you act on it." She looked at her son. "He had 15 opportunities to do something wrong and he didn't take any of them. That's not nothing." Noah turned that over. He looked at the door to the outside, then back at her. "He stays in the barn," he said. "That's still..." "Yes. That's still the situation. Nothing has changed about that." He nodded. One sharp nod, Thomas's nod. "Okay," he said. Rowan came in from the barn as the light was properly starting, stomping snow from his boots at the door. He looked at Evelyn, and she could tell he'd registered her face and was filing it away in the same way she'd been filing things about him, without comment, without fuss, just storing the information. "Everything there?" he said, nodding at the strongbox. "Everything." He poured himself coffee, leaned against the counter. He had the look of a man who had been awake for a long time and had made his peace with remaining so. "There's a rider named Garrett who goes through Harlan's Creek twice a week. Carries mail, packages, that kind of thing. He comes past the Junction Road on Wednesdays and Saturdays." "Today is Wednesday," Evelyn said. Today is Wednesday, he confirmed. I need to write a letter. I'll ride to the junction and hold him if you need an hour. She needed 40 minutes. She wrote 2 letters, one to the territorial court requesting an expedited hearing on Gerald Harper's custody and property filing, citing newly recovered original documentation and the existence of a material witness. The second letter was harder, and she sat with it for 10 minutes before she wrote it. It was addressed to Aldous Crimp, above the farrier's shop in Cutter's Bluff. She did not threaten him. She did not beg him. She told him simply and directly that she had the original will and the original deeds, and that what he had been told to certify was a fabrication, and that there were going to be proceedings in which the truth would come out one way or another, and that a man who came forward voluntarily was in a very different position than a man who was called forward under subpoena. She told him she understood he had been frightened into doing what he'd done, and that being frightened into a wrong thing was different from choosing a wrong thing, and that the court would likely see it that way too. She sealed both letters and gave them to Rowan, who rode to the junction without breakfast. He came back 2 hours later. Garrett took them, he said, coming in and shaking snow from his coat. Gave him extra to push the court letter up priority. Thank you. He sat down at the table for the first time she could remember him doing it at a meal. Clara set a plate of eggs in front of him without being asked, which made Evelyn look at Clara sideways, and Clara shrugged with the guileless efficiency of an 11-year-old who has already decided where she stands on something. Owen was already in his chair. May had stopped crying for the 3rd morning in a row, which felt significant. Lily was under the table having a separate breakfast with Mrs. Button that involved an upturned cup and a great deal of negotiation. Henry came in from outside, pulled off his gloves, and sat down in the chair next to Rowan as naturally as if he had been doing it his whole life. Rowan looked around the table. He didn't say anything. He picked up his fork. And it was ordinary. That was the strange and somehow painful thing about it. It was ordinary, a table of people eating breakfast in the morning, except that 3 weeks ago these people had been strangers, and the morning before that Evelyn had stood on an auction platform in the snow, and the ordinary thing felt very fragile, the way thin ice feels fragile, the kind you walk on anyway because you have to get to the other side. She looked at Rowan across the table and found that he was looking at her. She looked away first. She was thinking about Harlan's Creek and the territorial court, and whether Aldous Crimp would open her letter and what he would do after he did. She was thinking about Gerald's next move, because Gerald always had a next move. She was thinking about the sealed letter Thomas had written to his brother that she had not yet opened and was not yet sure she should open. She was thinking that the strongbox was on the shelf above the stove where she could see it, and that was good. That was something. That was more than she'd had a month ago. She was thinking that the table was full, all 8 chairs, and that the last time 8 people had sat at her kitchen table, it had been a birthday, and Thomas had been at the head of it. Outside, the wind picked up and pressed at the windows with that low, purposeful sound it made when it meant business. The mountains around the valley held the sound in and sent it back. There was a letter making its way to Harlan's Creek. There was a frightened old man above a farrier's shop with a decision to make. There was a courthouse somewhere in this territory with a filing in it that had Gerald Harper's name on it, and now there were documents and a morning and a table of people who had made it through one more night. It was not enough yet. But it was not nothing. And Evelyn Harper had learned in the past month the specific and unglamorous art of doing everything possible with not nothing. The reply from the territorial court came 9 days later, carried by Garrett on his Wednesday run, and it was not what Evelyn had hoped for, and not as bad as she had feared, which put it somewhere in the category of things you accept because you don't have a choice. The court had received her filing. The presiding judge for Gerald Harper's custody and property claim was a man named Honorable District Judge Silas Varn, appointed 4 years ago out of the Capitol, no known connection to Gerald Harper or Judge Crowell. That was the good part. The hearing date had been set for 3 weeks out, a Friday, in Harlan's Creek, at the Territorial Courthouse on Millbrook Street. That was the part Evelyn read 3 times, running the calendar in her head, counting the days, thinking about what 3 weeks meant in practical terms. 3 weeks was long enough for Gerald to do damage. 3 weeks was also long enough to prepare. She had not yet heard from Aldous Crimp. She told herself that silence didn't mean no. Old men who had done frightened, wrong things and were being asked to stand up and say so publicly did not move quickly. She knew that. She told herself that twice a day for the first week and once a day for the second, and by the start of the third week, she had mostly stopped telling herself anything and was simply watching the road. Rowan watched the road too, though he did it the way he did most things, without appearing to. She caught him at it twice, standing at the barn door in the early morning with his coffee, eyes on the junction point where the road from Cutter's Bluff met the valley track. He didn't comment on it when she caught him, and she didn't comment on it either. The household had settled into something she didn't have a clean word for. Not normal. Not comfortable, exactly. Something more like functional, the way a leg healed crooked is still a leg. The children had their routines. Henry and Owen worked mornings with Rowan. Clara ran the kitchen with a quiet competence that still sometimes made Evelyn's breath catch, because Clara was 11 and should not have had to be this competent yet. May had taken to sitting with Rowan in the evenings after supper. Not talking, just sitting near him with a book, which said something about what she needed that Evelyn found too tender to look at directly. Noah did his work and kept his counsel, and watched Rowan with the specific patient suspicion of someone who has decided to be fair but hasn't decided to be convinced. The sealed letter from Thomas to Gerald sat on the shelf above the strongbox. Evelyn had not opened it. She went back and forth on it every other day. Open it, don't open it, it might be useful, it might be something she couldn't unknow, it might be nothing, it might be everything. She left it where it was. 12 days before the hearing, 3 things happened on the same afternoon. The first was that Dessel, Gerald's messenger, appeared on the valley road again. Rowan saw him from the barn and was in the yard when the man arrived, which meant Evelyn had to hear what he'd brought secondhand. Gerald had amended his filing. He had added a second count, not just the custody and property claim, but a formal allegation that Evelyn Harper had conspired with an unnamed third party to unlawfully enter and remove property from the Harper estate. He was claiming the strongbox and its contents were estate property and that Evelyn had stolen them. Evelyn sat with that for about 2 minutes. Then she said, "He knows we went to the house." "Nora," Rowan said. "Maybe. Or he sent someone to check the house and they found the floorboard." She turned it over. "It doesn't matter how. What matters is he's now claiming the documents themselves are inadmissible because they were recovered through trespass. Can he do that?" "He can argue it. Whether Judge Varn agrees is another thing." She looked at the strongbox. "We need a lawyer. Nearest one who isn't in Gerald's pocket is probably Harlan's Creek. Then we need to write another letter." The second thing that happened was that Noah came in from the yard 20 minutes later and told her quietly that he had found tracks on the North Ridge line, boot prints, 2 sets, heading east, recent enough that the edges were still clean. Someone had been watching the ranch. She didn't ask him how he'd gotten up to the North Ridge without her noticing. She was learning not to underestimate what Noah did when she wasn't looking. Rowan went out and looked at the tracks himself. He came back and said they were at least a day old, and the angle suggested observation rather than approach. Whoever it was had been looking down into the valley from above, not moving toward the house. "He's mapping the place," Rowan said. "Figuring out who's here, how many, routine. For what purpose?" Rowan's expression said what he didn't, which was that there were several possible purposes and none of them were good. That night, Rowan moved a cot to the main house. He put it in the front room near the door, and he did not ask Evelyn's permission because he didn't frame it as something he was doing for himself. He framed it as a precaution for the children. She understood the distinction and accepted it. The third thing that happened was the letter from Aldous Crimp. It came not through Garrett, but by a different hand, a boy of about 12 she didn't recognize, who appeared at the kitchen door around supper time and handed Clara an envelope and left before anyone could ask him any questions. The envelope had no return address. Inside was a single page in a hand that shook in a way that old age and cold, and she suspected fear, had made shake equally. "Mrs. Harper," it read, "I have received your letter and I have read it a number of times. I am not a man who has done many things in his life that I am ashamed of, and I am having some difficulty carrying this one. What Mr. Gerald Harper asked me to certify was not true, and I knew it was not true when I certified it. He told me what would happen to my nephew's business. My nephew depends on me for his livelihood, if I did not do as he asked. I am telling you this not to excuse what I did, but to explain it. I am 71 years old, and I am not in good health, and I am not certain I am able to travel to Harlan's Creek. But if someone were to come to Cutter's Bluff and take my testimony in writing before a proper witness, I would sign it. I would sign whatever was true. I want to stop carrying this. A. Crimp. Evelyn read the letter twice. She read it a third time to make sure she was reading it correctly, that she wasn't finding what she wanted to find in something that said something different. She handed it to Rowan. He read it. He handed it back. Someone needs to go to Cutter's Bluff, he said. I know. Not you. She started to object, and he held up one hand, not stopping her, just indicating he wasn't finished. Gerald's amended filing names you specifically. If you walk into Cutter's Bluff right now before that hearing, he could argue you were attempting to interfere with a witness. It would hand him something to use against you. He paused. I'll go. I'll take Noah. Noah is 14. Noah is the most clear-headed person in this house besides you, and you can't go. He looked at her steadily. I'll take him. We go in, we get the written testimony, we come back. 2 days at most. Evelyn thought about it. She thought about all the ways it could go wrong, which was how she thought about most things now. Not pessimism, just the learned habit of a woman who had been surprised by disaster once and intended to see it coming the next time. Noah has to agree, she said. Noah agreed before she finished the sentence. They left the following morning. Evelyn stood on the porch and watched them go, Rowan and her oldest son riding side by side down the valley road, and she had the unsettling experience of feeling two contradictory things at once, grateful and terrified, and not being able to resolve them into something cleaner. Henry appeared beside her on the porch. They'll be fine, he said. You sound like Rowan, she said. Is that bad? She looked at her 12-year-old son. No, she said. It's not bad. They were gone 2 days and 4 hours, which was 4 hours longer than Rowan had said, and Evelyn spent those 4 hours doing absolutely everything she could think of to avoid standing at the window. She failed at this. She stood at the window for most of them. When they came back, both of them intact, she stayed on the porch and did not run to the yard because she had 6 children watching and she was not going to demonstrate to them how frightened she had been. She stood on the porch with her arms crossed and her face composed and waited for them to get close enough to read. Rowan's face said it had gone well. Noah's face said something had happened that he was still processing. They came inside and Rowan laid the papers on the table. 4 pages, witnessed and signed. Aldous Crimp's written testimony, in his shaking hand describing in specific detail the conversation with Gerald Harper, in which Gerald had told him exactly what would happen to his nephew's leather goods business if Crimp did not certify the forged probate papers. It named the date. It named the papers. It named the threat. He cried, Noah said. He said it not with contempt, but with the uncertain gravity of a boy who has watched an old man cry and doesn't yet know where to put that. When he signed it, he just sat there and cried. Evelyn put her hand on Noah's shoulder briefly. He let her. This is enough, she said, looking at the testimony. With the original will and the deeds and this is enough for Judge Varn to see the whole picture. We still need a lawyer to present it, Rowan said. I wrote to one in Harlan's Creek, a man named Pemberton. He replied 3 days ago. I didn't want to say anything until you were back. He'll take the case. She looked up. He's not cheap. I'll cover it, Rowan said. Rowan, I'll cover it, he said again, with the same tone he used for most things that were already decided. Not domineering, just clear. You can pay me back when you have the land back, or don't. I'm not keeping score. She wanted to argue on principle. She was practical enough not to. The week before the hearing was the longest week of Evelyn's life, and she had had some competition for that title recently. She went over the documents with Pemberton's instructions in mind. He had sent a detailed letter laying out what he needed, in what order, with what witnesses available. She organized everything in the strongbox. She read Thomas's will again and again until she could have recited it. She did not open the sealed letter to Gerald. She left it where it was. On the Wednesday before the Friday hearing, Nora Harper appeared at the ranch. She came alone, on a horse that was not one of Gerald's horses, which Evelyn noticed. She knocked at the front door instead of calling from the yard, which suggested she didn't want to be seen arriving. Evelyn opened the door, and they stood looking at each other for a moment in the thin winter light. He knows, Nora said, about Crimp. Someone told him Crimp had a visitor. What's he going to do? He's going to try to stop the hearing. Nora's voice was steady in a way that sounded effortful. He has a contact. Not Crowell, someone above Crowell, who he thinks can get a postponement filed before Friday. He's been on the Telegraph for 2 days. Can he get the postponement? I don't know. Gerald usually gets what he reaches for. She looked at Evelyn. But he's reaching harder than usual, which means he's scared. And Gerald scared does things that Gerald comfortable doesn't do. Her eyes flicked briefly to the room behind Evelyn, where she could likely hear the sounds of children. You need to be in that courthouse before you can get anything filed. First thing Friday morning. Don't wait for a scheduled time. Evelyn studied her. Why are you here, Nora? The second time. Why are you still doing this? Nora was quiet for a moment. Because I watched what he did to those children, and I told myself it was legal, and legal meant it was all right, and it isn't, she swallowed. And because I am done lying to myself about the kind of man I married, and this is the only useful thing I can do with that understanding right now. She did not ask to come in. She did not wait for a response. She turned and got back on her horse and rode back down the valley road. Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched her go and thought that grief did strange things to people. Thomas's death had cost her everything she had materially and also somehow clarified every important thing, and it appeared to be doing something not entirely different to Nora Harper, who had lost nothing material and was perhaps only now beginning to understand what she had actually lost. They left for Harlan's Creek on Thursday afternoon to make the distance by morning. All of them. Evelyn would not leave the children at the ranch, not with men watching from the ridge line, not with Gerald frightened and reaching. Rowan drove the wagon. Pemberton had arranged rooms at a boarding house on the edge of town. The territorial courthouse in Harlan's Creek was a squat stone building on Millbrook Street that looked like it had been built by someone who distrusted ornament. The inside smelled of old paper and lamp oil, and the particular staleness of rooms where difficult things were decided. Evelyn had been in courtrooms once before in her life, for a property boundary dispute Thomas had with a neighbor 8 years ago, and she remembered hating the formality of it. The way language became a different thing inside those walls, slower and more careful, and somehow less true, even when it was being used to find the truth. They were there when the doors opened at 7 in the morning. Pemberton was already inside. A compact, wire-haired man in his 50s with ink-stained fingers and an air of contained impatience, the kind of lawyer who had seen too many cases to be impressed by any of them, but still got sharp-eyed when the facts were on his side. He reviewed the documents one more time with Evelyn in the corridor, speaking quickly and quietly, and she answered every question he asked without hesitation because she had been preparing for every question he might ask for 3 weeks. Gerald arrived at 8:30. He came with 2 men she didn't recognize and Walter Pruitt and a lawyer named Cass, who had the polished, particular confidence of someone accustomed to winning because he had powerful clients, rather than because he was especially gifted. Gerald saw Evelyn across the corridor, and for one moment, just one, the composure slipped enough to show what was underneath it, which was not the cold indifference of the auction platform, but something hotter and more personal. He had not expected her to be here early. He had not expected her to be ready. He recovered in about 2 seconds and turned away. Pemberton noticed. "Good," he said, very quietly, to Evelyn. "He's off his plan." Judge Silas Varn was a narrow man in his 60s with a gray beard clipped close and eyes that moved constantly, absorbing everything. He entered at 9 and the room stood and sat, and he looked at both tables with the expression of a man who has seen every variety of human dishonesty and has not been surprised by any of it for 20 years, but remains professionally interested. Cass opened for Gerald. He was smooth and organized. He presented Gerald's claim with the clean architecture of someone who had rehearsed it many times, emphasizing the absence of a registered will, the validity of the probate certification, the legitimate inheritance rights of the eldest male heir. He said nothing about the auction. He called it a welfare placement, which was Gerald's phrase, and Evelyn felt her jaw tighten hearing it said in a courtroom. Pemberton let him finish. Then he stood up. He laid the will on the table. He identified it, described it, established its date and witness signatures. Then he laid the land deeds. Then the registry book. He did it without preamble or theater, just one document after another, each one speaking for itself, and the room was very quiet. He called Evelyn to speak. She had not known she would be speaking, and she had told herself she was prepared and found, standing there, that prepared was different from ready. She gripped the railing in front of her, and she told the truth in the specific order Pemberton had told her to tell it. And she did not look at Gerald, and she did not falter. And when Cass cross-examined her, she answered each question with the particular calm of a woman who has nothing to hide and knows it. Cass pushed on the trespass charge, the recovery of the strongbox from what was now, he argued, Gerald Harper's legally held property. Pemberton objected. The property was not legally held, he said. That is precisely the matter before this court. The documents were recovered from a home that belonged to Mrs. Harper's late husband and that has not yet been legally adjudicated. There was no court order prohibiting her access. There was no trespass. Varn made a note. Then Pemberton submitted the written testimony of Aldous Crimp. The room changed when Cass read it. Evelyn watched him read it and watched the color shift in his face as he understood what he was holding. Not just a refutation of the probate certification, but a specific, dated, named account of Gerald Harper threatening a 71-year-old man into committing fraud. It was not abstract. It was granular. Crimp had remembered what Gerald wore that day. He had remembered the exact phrase Gerald had used about the nephew's business. He had remembered because he had been living with it for months, and you remember things you can't stop thinking about in that particular excruciating detail. Cass passed it to Gerald. Evelyn watched Gerald read it. He read it once, set it down, and looked at the middle distance. He did not look at his lawyer. Pemberton requested that the court call Aldous Crimp for direct testimony. Crimp was not in the courthouse. He had not been able to travel, as he'd told Evelyn in his letter. Varn studied the written testimony and the witness certification attached to it and said he would accept it as submitted evidence pending further examination. Cass objected. Varn overruled him. Gerald's lawyer made 3 more arguments in the next 20 minutes. Varn listened to all of them with the impassive attention of a man who is already thinking past what he's hearing. He asked one question of Pemberton about the water rights documentation. He asked one question of Cass about the probate registration date. He made notes. Then he called a recess. Evelyn sat in the corridor with her children ranged around her. Lily on her lap, May pressed against her left side. The older 3 in chairs nearby with the particular rigid stillness of people trying not to show how frightened they are. Rowan was at the end of the corridor, standing, because he was not the kind of man who sat when he was anxious. He had his hat in his hands and he was turning it slowly. Noah came and sat next to Evelyn. "What do you think?" he said. "I think we gave him everything true that there is," she said, "and now we see what he does with true." "That's not very comforting." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." The recess lasted 40 minutes. Evelyn counted every one of them. When Varn returned, the room stood and sat again, and he looked at his notes, and then he looked up, and he spoke in the measured, even cadence of a man who has decided something and sees no need to make theater of the delivery. He said that the original will presented by Mrs. Evelyn Harper was a valid legal document, properly witnessed and dated, and that it superseded any claim of intestate succession. He said that the probate certification filed by Gerald Harper had been obtained through coercion as documented by sworn testimony, and that it was therefore fraudulent and void. He said that all property rights, land deeds, and water rights documented in the recovered strongbox were hereby restored to Evelyn Harper as the legal heir of Thomas Harper's estate. He said that Gerald Harper's custody and property filing was dismissed in its entirety. He paused. Then he said that he was referring the matter of the fraudulent probate certification and the associated coercion of a court officer to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for criminal review. He said it in the same voice he'd said everything else. He closed his notes. He stood. The room stood with him. Evelyn did not hear much of what happened in the next few minutes. There was Pemberton speaking to her, and she answered him, and she was reasonably coherent about it. There was Cass and Gerald on the other side of the room, and she did not look at them directly, but she was aware of Gerald in the peripheral way. You are aware of something you have been braced against for a long time, and can now perhaps, very slowly and carefully, stop bracing against. There was Rowan crossing the room toward her. He stopped in front of her. He didn't say anything. He looked at her with the same steadiness he'd looked at her with at the bottom of the auction platform steps. "Okay?" he said. "Just that." "I think so," she said. "Ask me again in an hour." He almost smiled, closer than usual. Noah was already standing. He had May by the hand and was telling her something, low and quick, and May's face was doing something Evelyn hadn't seen it do in weeks. Something tentative and upward and unguarded. Henry had Owen by the shoulder. Clara had Lily and was bouncing her slightly, automatically, the way she'd been doing since the funeral. Lily was waving Mrs. Button at the ceiling for reasons known only to herself. Evelyn stood up, outside the courthouse. The February cold hit her like a door opening, and she stood on the top step and looked at Harlan's Creek's modest main street and the mountains visible at the far end of it and thought, with the specific, exhausted astonishment of someone who has been fighting for so long that fighting has started to feel like the natural condition of things, that it was over. This part. The court part. The piece she had been able to fight with paper. Gerald was not going to walk out of that courthouse and simply accept what had happened. She knew that. Men like Gerald Harper did not accept things. They regrouped. There would be appeals possibly, challenges certainly, the grinding long aftermath of a legal decision that the losing party refuses to honor in spirit, even when forced to honor it in fact. But the land was hers. Thomas's will was on the record. Aldous Crimp's testimony was in the file. Gerald Harper's name was being given to a prosecutor. It was not everything. It was not the clean, complete resolution that the world owed her and had not previously shown any inclination to deliver. But it was real, and it was documented, and it was hers. 6 children came out the courthouse door behind her and gathered on the steps in the cold, and Evelyn looked at each of their faces, one by one, the way she had looked at them on the auction platform, but differently. On the platform she had been memorizing them because she was afraid of losing them. Now she was looking at them because they were here, all of them, together, on a courthouse step in February, with the truth on record and the land waiting. May reached up and took her hand. Evelyn held it. Rowan came out last. He stood slightly behind and to the right of the group, where he had been standing since the first night, present, not intrusive, the specific distance of a man who does not presume. He looked at Evelyn, and she looked at him, and he gave her the nod. The same one he'd given her in every quiet moment that had mattered. The well, the barn, the kitchen table, the ridge road at midnight. She nodded back. She turned to face the street. There was land to reclaim, a house to go back to, a family that had survived something and was still in one piece and still standing. There was a long road between here and anything that looked like settled, and she knew it. She could see the mountains from the courthouse steps. She had always been able to see mountains from wherever she stood in this territory, and she had always found them either oppressive or orienting depending on the state of her life. Right now, standing on these steps with her children around her, they looked like something you could measure yourself against and not lose. The ride back from Harlan's Creek took the better part of a day and a half, and for most of it nobody talked much, which was fine. The children slept in stages in the wagon bed, leaning against each other in the unself-conscious way of people who have been through enough together that personal space has stopped being a priority. Rowan drove. Evelyn sat beside him on the bench, which was the first time she had ridden up front with him since the night they went to the Harper house, and neither of them commented on that. Around midday on the second day, with the Caldwell Valley Road coming up ahead, Rowan said, "What happens now?" "We go back to the house," she said. "My house." "When?" "Soon as it can be arranged." She had been thinking about this since the courthouse steps. She had been thinking about it with the specific, practical focus of a woman who had learned that thinking about the next concrete step was the only reliable way to keep the larger terror of everything at arm's length. There are things to do first. The land needs to be walked. I need to see what Gerald touched, what he moved, what condition the cattle are in. The house needs to be assessed. The water lines may have frozen. She paused. And I need to open Thomas's letter. Rowan glanced at her sideways. He knew about the letter. She had mentioned it once, the night after they got back from the Harper house, and he had not asked about it since. "You ready for that?" "No," she said. "But I've been waiting until the legal part was settled, and that's settled now, so I don't have a reason to keep waiting except that I'm frightened of it." "That's a reason," he said. "Not a good enough one." He looked at the road. "Do you want company when you open it?" She thought about that honestly, which took longer than a simple question should. "No," she said finally. "But thank you." He nodded. They got back to the Caldwell Valley Ranch in the late afternoon. The children woke up and piled out of the wagon with the noise and disorganization of people released from a confined space, and the ranch absorbed them the way it had been absorbing them for weeks. Lily immediately headed for the kitchen looking for something to eat. Owen gravitated toward the barn. Henry started helping Rowan with the horses before the wagon was fully stopped. The domesticity of it was so ordinary and so strange that Evelyn had to stand still for a moment in the yard just to let it settle. She went inside. She took the sealed letter from the shelf where it had been sitting for 3 weeks. She went to the back room, the small ground floor room where she and the girls had been sleeping, and she closed the door and she sat on the edge of the bed and she opened it. Thomas's handwriting. She had to stop for a moment at the sight of it, that familiar slope and economy of his letters, the way he made his T's and the habit he had of crossing his Z's, even though there was no convention requiring it. She had not seen his handwriting since the funeral, and she had not realized until this moment how much she had missed it as a physical thing, not just as communication, but as proof that he had been real, that he had sat somewhere and put a pen to paper and thought about what he wanted to say. Gerald, the letter read, if you're reading this, something has gone wrong. I don't know what. Maybe I died too soon. Maybe you've done something I couldn't predict, though if I'm honest, I could predict more than I let on. We never talked plainly, you and I, and I'm sorry for that. I told myself it wasn't necessary. I told myself that family meant we could leave things unsaid and they'd still be understood. I was wrong about that. I know you've always believed the ranch should have come to you. You're the older son. I understand that logic. But our father left it to me because he saw how you handled what he gave you to manage in the years before he died, and he made his judgment, and I didn't make it for him. I've never apologized for that because it wasn't mine to apologize for. What I'm asking you, and I'm asking, not telling, because I don't have the right to tell you anything anymore, is to let Evelyn and the children keep what is theirs. Not what is mine. What is theirs. She built that life alongside me. Those children were born into it. Whatever you feel you are owed, it is not the roof over their heads and the ground under their feet. If you can't do that, then I suppose you'll do what you'll do. But I want you to know that I know you, Gerald. I know the man you are under the man you show people. And I don't believe that man wants to look at himself in a mirror 20 years from now and see someone who put his brother's widow on an auction block. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. I hope I'm not wrong about this. Your brother, Thomas. Evelyn sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. She was not going to cry again. She had cried enough. At the strongbox, at Pemberton's table, twice in the barn, when she thought no one was nearby, and once she'd been wrong about that and had found Owen standing 3 feet away looking at her with the flat, careful expression of a boy who has decided the correct thing to do is pretend he hasn't seen what he's seen. She was done crying, or at least she was done crying today. And she folded the letter and held it and thought about Thomas writing it, sitting at that desk, in that study, above that strongbox full of provisions for the people he was going to leave behind, and writing to his brother with the stubborn, heartbroken hope of a man who believed people could still choose to be better than they'd been. Gerald had not chosen that. He had read whatever he'd read at whatever point, and he had chosen differently. That was a thing she was going to have to carry for a long time, maybe forever. Not guilt. She had not done anything wrong, but the weight of understanding that a person she had called family had looked at her children and made the calculation he'd made anyway. She put the letter in the strongbox with the others. She put the lid down. Then she went back out to the kitchen and started helping Clara with supper, because supper needed to happen, and thinking about Thomas was not going to stop it from needing to happen. They went back to the Harper Ranch on a Thursday, 12 days after the courthouse. Rowan drove the wagon again, the children in the back, and when the house came into view, Evelyn heard May make a small sound beside her and felt Noah go very still on her other side. The house looked smaller than she remembered. That happened sometimes when you'd been away from a place long enough. It shrank back to its actual dimensions once you weren't living inside it. Gerald's men had been through it. That was clear from the moment she opened the front door. Nothing had been destroyed. That would have been too obvious, too clearly actionable. But things had been moved, searched, left slightly wrong. Drawers not fully closed, books out of order, the kitchen pantry half empty. She went through the house room by room with Noah and Henry behind her, cataloging, and she kept her face neutral because she was not going to let her children see her unraveling over this. In the study, the desk had been pulled from the wall. The loose floorboard had been found, obviously, given Gerald's amended filing, and replaced, but carelessly, the edge of it not sitting flush the way Thomas had always kept it. She pressed her foot to it and felt it give and thought about Thomas fitting it, leveling it, showing her where the key was, and she put that thought away. The cattle were in rougher shape than she wanted, whatever arrangements Gerald had made for their care. In the weeks he'd held the property had been minimal. She counted the herd twice and came up 8 head short and could not tell whether they had been sold or had simply wandered through neglected fencing. The east field fencing was down in 2 places. The water trough in the south pasture had frozen solid and cracked. Henry stood beside her at the south pasture fence with his arms crossed, looking at the cracked trough with the expression of someone making a list. "We can fix the fencing in a week if Rowan helps," he said. "Rowan's got his own ranch," Evelyn said. "I know. I'm saying if he helps." She looked at her son. He was 12 years old and he was making repair estimates on a damaged cattle ranch. She thought about who he had been 8 weeks ago. Not worse, just younger, still carrying the easy assumption that the adults in his life had all the logistics covered. That assumption had been removed from him, and she was not sure whether to be sorry about it or proud of him for what had grown in its place. "We'll ask him," she said. Rowan helped. He did not make a production of it, and he did not require asking twice. He rode over from the Caldwell Valley Ranch 3 mornings a week through the rest of February and into March, and he and Henry and Noah worked the fencing and the trough and the barn roof that had been leaking before any of this started, and had been leaking worse since. He taught Noah how to read a fence line for stress points, where rot was likely to appear first, how to reset a post in frozen ground without cracking it. He did not do it with the self-conscious intentionality of a man who has decided to be a mentor. He did it the way he did everything, because it was a thing that needed doing and he was there. Evelyn watched this from the kitchen window more than she would admit. Gerald's appeal came in March. She had known it would. Pemberton had warned her, had said to expect it, had said that men like Gerald Harper always tried the appeal even when there was nothing to appeal with, because the appeal itself was a tactic. It kept things unsettled, kept her in a defensive posture, cost her money and time and energy she would rather be spending elsewhere. Pemberton filed the response. She paid him from the sale of 2 horses she didn't strictly need, which stung, but less than she'd expected. She was getting better at the calculus of necessary losses. The appeal was denied in April. She found out by letter, and she read it twice and put it in the strongbox and went back to planting the kitchen garden, which was 2 weeks behind because March had gone long and cold. The criminal referral moved more slowly. The territorial prosecutor's office sent a man to interview Aldous Crimp in Cutter's Bluff, and then interviewed Nora Harper, which was something Evelyn had not known would happen until Nora sent her a brief note that said only, "They came to the house. I told them what I know. I have moved to my sister's in Delwood." And Evelyn read that note and held it for a while. She did not know what it had cost Nora to say what she'd said to the prosecutor's man. She did not know what kind of marriage Nora had been living inside. What she had seen and told herself was normal. What line had finally become uncrossable for her? She wrote Nora back. A short letter, careful, not presumptuous. She said she was grateful. She said she hoped Delwood suited her. She said the door was open if Nora ever found herself in the valley. She was not sure if she meant it. She sent it anyway. In late April, Gerald Harper was formally charged with fraud and coercion of a court officer. His name appeared in the Cutter's Bluff weekly paper in a short paragraph that said very little and implied quite a lot. Evelyn did not see the paper herself. Noah brought it home from a trip into town and left it on the kitchen table without comment, which was exactly the right thing to do. She read it. She set it down. She felt something she had been bracing against for so long that she hadn't noticed anymore it was there. That constant low-grade tension, the waiting for the next thing Gerald would do. Loosen slightly. Not release. Loosen. She was not naive enough to think a charge was a conviction or that a conviction ended a man like Gerald Harper's capacity to cause damage. But the charge was public. The fraud was on record. The name was in the paper. And once a thing was in the paper, the people who needed to pretend they hadn't seen something could no longer pretend as easily. The baker from Cutter's Bluff stopped her on the road in early May and said he was glad things had worked out. She thanked him with more graciousness than he deserved. The woman from the church committee who had brought the casserole to the funeral came out to the ranch with a second casserole and an apology that was awkward and incomplete and clearly cost her something to say. Evelyn accepted it. She was not going to perform forgiveness she didn't fully feel, but she was also not going to make enemies out of people who were capable of uncomfortable growth. The frontier was not large. You lived alongside people and you worked with what you had. Rowan came to dinner the first Sunday of May. He had been to dinner before many times through the winter and early spring, but this was the first dinner that felt different in a way that Evelyn couldn't have articulated cleanly if pressed. The children were easier, maybe. Or she was. Or the quality of the light through the kitchen window was changing as the season turned, and that changed the mood of everything in the room. After the children had cleared away, and the younger ones were in bed, and Noah and Clara had retreated to the front room with the particular tact of teenagers who have decided to be elsewhere, Evelyn and Rowan sat at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee. "Your cattle count is back up," he said, "with the 2 new calves. Still short of where we were. You'll be back there by fall." She wrapped both hands around her cup. Outside, the May dark was soft in a way that winter dark wasn't, and the kitchen was warm, and it was quiet. "I want to say something to you," she said. He waited. "When you made that bid in Cutter's Bluff," she said, "you told Henry you saw something that needed stopping. That's what you said." She looked at him. "I've thought about that a lot. What it cost you. What you walked into without knowing any of it. Without knowing me, or the children, or what Gerald was capable of, or any of what came after." "I knew enough," he said. "You knew a man was putting a 4-year-old on an auction platform. That was enough." "It was a lot of money, Rowan." "It was," he agreed. He said it without defensiveness, just as a fact. "But I had it, and you needed it, and some things are not actually as complicated as they feel like they ought to be." She studied him across the table. She had been studying him for months, adding things to that file she'd started on the first night, and the file had gotten very full, and what she found in it was not a perfect man. He was solitary to the point of stubbornness. He withheld things about himself in ways that were sometimes frustrating. He expressed emotion through action almost exclusively and found words for it like pulling something from a tight space. He was also the most consistently decent person she had been in daily contact with since Thomas. And decency was not small, she had learned, in a world that produced men like Gerald Harper. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I want you to know that. This is my land and my house, and I'm going to build this back and stay here." "I know. But I've been thinking about what comes after the building." She kept her eyes on him. "And you're in that. When I think about what this looks like in 3 years or 5 years, you're in it. I don't know what that means practically, and I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I'm just—" She stopped, started over. "I spent a lot of months surviving. I'd like to think about living a little, and I keep thinking about it with you in the picture." Rowan looked at her for a long moment. He had the expression of a man who has been given something he was not sure he was going to receive and is taking a moment to understand that he has actually received it. "I've been in that picture for a while," he said quietly. "Didn't know if you were." "I was slow." "You had reasonable things to be slow about." "I still do," she said. "I want to be honest about that. This isn't simple. I have 6 children and a ranch and a brother-in-law who's going to trial and a dozen other things, and I am not in a position to promise that any of this will be easy." "I know what I'd be walking into," he said. "I've been walking into it for 4 months." "That's different from committing to it, is it?" He looked at her steadily. "I fixed your fencing. I rode with you at midnight through frozen country. I slept in a barn for 2 months. The corner of his mouth moved. "At what point does that stop being temporary behavior?" She looked at him, and she felt something that she had been rationing carefully. Not because she didn't feel it, but because feeling it too freely had seemed dangerous while everything was still in pieces. The pieces were not all back together. They might never be exactly back together. But she was standing in her kitchen in May with the land restored and the children asleep, and a man across the table who had walked into her disaster with no obligation and stayed. "I'd like you to stay," she said. "Properly. Not the barn." He nodded once. "All right," he said. That was it. That was the whole of the conversation. It was not a proposal with ceremony, and it was not a declaration with speeches, and she didn't want either of those things. What she wanted was exactly what she had, a quiet kitchen and a man who said all right and meant it all the way down. They were married in June, outside on the land, between the 2 properties, not in a church, not in a courthouse. Pemberton came and served as the legal witness. The children were in their best clothes that Clara had spent 3 days pressing. Lily wore a ribbon in her hair and kept touching it to make sure it was still there. Owen stood very straight in a way that suggested he had been practicing. The townspeople came, more of them than Evelyn had expected. The baker, the schoolteacher, several families from the outer ranches who had heard about the trial and about the courthouse and had made up their minds about things in the months since. The woman with the casserole cried. Evelyn found this irritating and touching in about equal measure. Noah walked her through the grass to where Rowan was standing. She had not asked him to do this. He had simply appeared beside her at the right moment and offered his arm, and she had taken it, and she had felt in that moment the full complicated weight of who he was becoming. Not a replacement for Thomas. Not a small version of Thomas, but something entirely himself, growing into a person she hadn't yet fully met and couldn't wait to know. When she reached Rowan, Noah let go of her arm. He stepped back. He looked at Rowan with the measuring, careful look he'd had since the first night in the wagon, and then something in it settled, not disappeared. Noah was not the kind of person who simply stopped assessing, but settled, the way a door that's been slightly ajar finally closes all the way. "You take care of her," Noah said. Rowan looked at him. "I know," he said. "I will." "And us," Noah added. It was not a challenge. It was a statement of fact about the scope of the thing. "I know that too," Rowan said. Noah nodded. He went to stand with Henry and Owen. The ceremony was short and plain, and nobody cried except Lily, who was not crying about the wedding but had discovered a sticker burr in her stocking, which Clara dealt with efficiently. Afterward, there was food and noise and the kind of gathering that happens when people who have been through something hard come out the other side and need to be in the same place together for a while. May laughed at something the school teacher's daughter said. A real laugh. The kind that surprised her own face into an expression she'd lost for a while and was clearly glad to find again. Owen ate an astonishing amount of pie with the quiet, systematic determination he brought to everything. Henry had gotten into a conversation with one of the neighboring ranchers about fencing technique and was holding his own in it in a way that made Rowan catch Evelyn's eye across the yard. She caught it. She didn't look away first this time. In the months that followed, the work was what the work always was. Constant and physical and often unglamorous and occasionally brutal in the way that frontier life was brutal. Not dramatically, not with the clean violence of the stories people told, but in the grinding, ordinary ways. A calf that didn't make it, a stretch of fence brought down by a heavy snow, a summer dry enough to worry the hay yield. Rowan integrated into the Harper so naturally that within a season it was difficult to remember the specific division between his cattle and hers, his knowledge and hers, because what they built was not an addition of two separate things, but something that had fused into a third thing with its own character. The Caldwell Valley Ranch he leased to a young couple from the Eastern Territory who needed a start. He kept a partial interest in it. He was not sentimental about the property itself. It was the place he had lived alone for 3 years, and he did not need to live alone anymore. Henry, at 15, knew the land the way Thomas had known it, with the kind of bone-deep literacy that comes from having worked every corner of it. He talked sometimes about expanding into the northern acres that had always been considered marginal, and Rowan listened to him with the specific attention of someone who takes seriously what young people say when what they say is worth taking seriously. Noah, by 16, had started riding into Harlan's Creek on the weekends to read in Pemberton's office. He didn't announce this. Evelyn found out from Pemberton himself, who mentioned it in a letter with the observation that the boy had an instinct for the logic of law that was unusual in someone his age. When she asked Noah about it, he said, with the controlled care he still used for anything he felt strongly about, "I keep thinking about what would have happened to us if Pemberton hadn't known what he was doing. How many families that happens to, and there's nobody who knows what to do." He looked at her. "I want to know what to do." She looked at her son, and she thought about Thomas's sealed letter, the one she had put in the strongbox and would keep there. She thought about Thomas writing and hoping and being wrong about his brother and right about his children. "Then learn it," she said. May, at 11, had started keeping a journal. She didn't share it, and Evelyn didn't ask to see it. The writing seemed to do something for her that the crying had done in the early months, a way of processing, of putting the outside world into a form she could hold and examine. She was still the most emotionally visible of the children, still the one who felt things at the surface where everyone could see them, But that visibility had become something she moved through rather than something that moved her. Owen turned 9 in July and remained, as he had always been, the most opaque of her children. He said less than the others, worked as hard as any of them, and had a particular quality of attention to animals, to broken things, to people in difficulty, that Evelyn had long suspected was its own kind of language. Rowan understood him, or at least seemed to, in the wordless way that two people who communicate primarily through action recognize each other. They spent a lot of time in the barn together. Neither of them reported on what they discussed. Clara turned 13 in August and had been running the household with an efficiency that was starting to look less like necessity and more like preference. She had opinions about organization, about systems, about the correct way to put up preserves for winter that were more developed and more correct than most adults Evelyn knew. She was going to be extraordinary in whatever direction she decided to go, and she was already, at 13, beginning to turn in certain directions to see which ones felt like hers. Lily was 5 in the fall, and she had no memory of the auction platform. Evelyn had thought about this, whether to tell her, when, how. Rowan had said, when she'd brought it up, that Lily would know when she was ready to know, and that forcing the timeline didn't usually serve the child. Evelyn wasn't sure that was right, and she wasn't sure it was wrong. She kept it for later, for a different version of Lily who would be able to hold it. For now, Lily called Rowan by his name, had never called him anything else, had never asked why she called him something different from what she called Evelyn. She accepted him with the uncomplicated totality of a child who has decided someone is hers and sees no need to examine the process further. On an evening in late October, when the harvest was in and the cold was coming back and the mountains were starting to show white at the peaks again, Evelyn was sitting on the porch watching the light go down over the valley. Rowan came out and sat beside her. They had been doing this, sitting on the porch in the evening, for months, and it had become one of the things she counted as good, the specific good of a thing that is ordinary and reliable and yours. She was thinking about the auction platform. She found herself thinking about it sometimes, not with horror anymore. The horror had blunted with time, as it had to, but with a kind of close attention, the way you think about the moment something turned. She had stood on that platform with 6 children, and she had told them not to cry, and she had looked at 30 faces, and not one of them had stepped forward. And then a man in a worn coat at the back of the crowd had said, "I'll double it." She had thought, at the time, that she was escaping one nightmare or entering another. She had not been able to imagine anything like this from that platform, and that was worth something, the fact that she had not been able to imagine it. It meant that what she had now was not something she had planned her way into or earned through some clear arc of deserving. It was something that had arrived because a man had stopped thinking and acted on what he saw, and because she had been stubborn enough to keep moving, and because her children had been resilient in ways she hadn't asked them to be, and because an old man in a room above a farrier's shop had gotten tired of carrying something heavy and put it down. She had learned, in this year, not to trust the version of life that promised clean resolutions. Life did not produce clean resolutions. Gerald Harper's trial was ongoing and would likely take another year before it concluded. The 8 missing cattle had not come back. The northern acres that Henry wanted to develop were going to cost more than they had to spend right now. Noah was going to need money for legal schooling that they didn't yet have a clear plan for. There were mornings when the weight of all of it pressed down on her exactly as it always had, when she woke at 4 in the morning with her heart going and the list assembling itself in her chest before she was fully awake. But she also had this porch, and this evening, and 6 children alive and fed and becoming people, and a man beside her who had said all right and meant it and was still here. "What are you thinking about?" Rowan asked. "The auction," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You think about it a lot." "Less than I used to, but yes." He looked at the mountains. "I drove past Cutter's Bluff last week," he said, coming back from the feed merchant. "They've taken the platform down." She looked at him. "When?" "Sometime in the last month, I think. There's just a bare patch of ground where it was." She sat with that. Someone had decided to take it down. She didn't know if it was the town's decision or one person's, or whether it was even connected to what had happened. Maybe it had simply rotted through. Maybe it had been taken down for entirely practical reasons that had nothing to do with her or her children. She would probably never know, and it didn't matter. What mattered was the bare patch of ground where it had been. The last light was going over the western ridge, that specific shade of orange-pink that late October produced, and that she had never been able to accurately describe to anyone who hadn't seen it. The children were inside. She could hear them, the specific overlapping sounds of 6 people in a house together, someone laughing, someone asking about something, Claire's voice cutting through to say something practical about dinner. "I keep thinking about what would have happened," she said, "if you hadn't been in Cutter's Bluff that morning." "I try not to think about that," Rowan said. "Why?" "Because it didn't happen." "But it almost did. Some version of it almost did." "Some version of everything almost happens," he said, "and then it doesn't, or it does, and you go from there." He looked at her. "You went from there. Whatever I did or didn't do, you went from there. You walked off that platform, and you kept going." She thought about that. It was not untrue. She had kept going. She had kept going through things she had not known she could get through, which was not the same as having been strong, because she hadn't always felt strong. She had often felt barely capable and held together with the thinnest kind of determination, the kind that isn't courage exactly, but is what you do when stopping is not an option, and so you simply don't stop. She had not been perfect through any of it. She had made choices out of fear that she would have made differently with more time. She had been too slow to trust, and then, maybe, too quick to trust in 1 or 2 moments. She had put too much weight on Noah and not enough on Clara in the early weeks, and had recognized it too late and had to correct for it. She was going to keep making choices like that, incomplete, human, based on what she could see at the time, for the rest of her life. So would Rowan. So would her children. That was not a failure. That was just the actual shape of a life. "I'm glad you were there," she said. "I'm going to spend a long time being glad you were there." He put his hand over hers on the porch railing, not squeezing it, not making a production of it, just putting it there. They sat like that while the light finished going out of the sky, and the valley went dark around them, and inside the house the sounds of 6 children being alive kept coming through the walls, and the mountains stood where they always stood, and the cold came in slowly, and neither of them moved. This was the thing that nobody had warned her about. Not the hardship, everyone warned you about the hardship, but the ordinary weight of good things, the way that an evening on a porch could hold so much that you almost couldn't contain it. The way that what you had built with your hands and your choices and your stubbornness could become, without your quite noticing the moment it happened, something that felt permanent. Not safe, not guaranteed, not clean, but permanent in the way that love is permanent. Not because it can't be taken from you, but because once it's real, not even the taking of it can make it have not been. The stars came out over the Caldwell Valley in their usual disorder, paying no attention to the family below them. The family below them paid no attention to the stars. They had enough to look at right here.